When Leona Helmsley died in 2007, she left behind an empire worth an estimated $2 to $4 billion. Not unusual for a real estate billionaire. What was unusual was who inherited it. Not her son, not her grandchildren, not even her business partners. She left it to her dog, a Maltese named Trouble, while two of her grandchildren received nothing. Absolutely nothing. This wasn't just eccentric behavior. This was a declaration, a final act of control that exposed decades of family dysfunction, resentment, and the corrosive power of enormous wealth. But Leona's story is just one thread in a much larger tapestry. Across the world, the wealthiest families in history have faced a paradox. They built empires that changed industries, shaped economies, and employed thousands. Yet when it came time to pass those empires to the next generation, many of these dynasties didn't transition smoothly. They fractured. They fought. They tore themselves apart. The Gettys, the Johnsons, the Redstones, the Murdochs, the Mars family, the Kochs, names that represent billions, sometimes hundreds of billions of dollars, names associated with power, influence, and legacy. And yet, behind the boardrooms and the Forbes lists, these families have endured bitter inheritance battles that revealed something most people never see. That immense wealth doesn't solve family problems. Often, it creates them. This isn't a story about money alone. It's about control, about love withheld and affection weaponized, about children raised in gilded cages who were never quite good enough, about patriarchs and matriarchs who confused authority with care, about siblings turned into rivals, about wills that read less like legal documents and more like final punishments. In the coming chapters, we're going to pull back the curtain on some of the most shocking, complex, and deeply human inheritance stories ever recorded. We'll explore how fortunes built over lifetimes were divided, disputed, and sometimes destroyed in the aftermath of death. We'll meet heirs who were cut off without explanation, executors who controlled billions, lawyers who became richer than the families they represented. And we'll see how these battles didn't just redistribute wealth. They redefined relationships, destroyed reputations, and in some cases, ended lives. These are not fairy tales. They're case studies in what happens when the thing that's supposed to bring security, legacy, and care becomes the source of the deepest pain. Because here's the truth that no amount of money can change. Inheritance is never just about assets. It's about worth. It's about being seen. It's about whether, in the end, you mattered to the person who mattered most. And for some of the richest heirs in history, the answer they received was devastating. Let's begin with one of the most infamous inheritance sagas in American history. A family that controlled a food empire worth billions. A mother who ruled with an iron fist. And a court battle that would expose just how far love and money had drifted apart. The Johnson family didn't just sell food. They built an empire that touched nearly every kitchen in America. Johnson & Johnson Pharmaceuticals. No, different Johnson. This is the family behind S.C. Johnson, the makers of Raid, Pledge, Glade, Windex, Ziploc, and dozens of other household products that generated billions in revenue every single year. A private company, meaning the family retained complete control. No shareholders, no public accountability, just one family, holding the reins of a massive commercial dynasty. At the center of that dynasty was a woman named Bettina Bancroft Johnson. Not the founder, not the CEO, but the widow of one of the company's heirs. and the mother of several more. By the time she died in 2017, her estate was valued at approximately $890 million. Not quite a billion, but close enough to place her among the wealthiest women in the country. Bettina had 6 children. In a normal family, you might expect that fortune to be divided equally. 6 ways, a little over $100 million each, life-changing wealth by any measure. But this wasn't a normal family, and Bettina wasn't interested in fairness. 3 of her children, the ones who had maintained relationships with her, who had stayed close, who had played by her rules, received their shares. The other 3 received almost nothing, and one of those 3 was her own daughter, Casey Johnson, a woman whose life would spiral into tabloid headlines, addiction, and an early death. A woman who would become one of the most visible cautionary tales about what happens when wealth and love become conditional. But before we get to Casey, we need to understand something about dynastic wealth. It operates differently than the wealth most people know. When you inherit a family business, you're not just inheriting money. You're inheriting expectations. You're inheriting a role. You're being told, implicitly or explicitly, that your value is tied to your usefulness to the empire. Stay in line, protect the brand, contribute to the legacy, and you'll be rewarded. Step out of line, embarrass the family, or worse, become a liability, and you'll be cut off. This is the environment Casey Johnson grew up in. She was born in 1979, the daughter of New York Jets owner Woody Johnson and his first wife, Sale Johnson. On her mother's side, she was connected to the S.C. Johnson fortune. On her father's side, she was part of the Johnson & Johnson pharmaceutical dynasty. She had access to everything: private schools, designer clothes, exotic vacations, social connections that opened every door. From the outside, her life looked perfect, but inside that world, something else was happening. Casey struggled with diabetes from a young age, a condition that required constant management and discipline. She also struggled with her identity, her purpose, and her place in a family that valued control and image above all else. As she grew older, those struggles intensified. She became known not for her contributions to the family business, but for her presence in the tabloids. Partying with Paris Hilton, public feuds, a turbulent romantic life, behavior that, in the world of dynastic families, is considered unforgivable. Her relationship with her mother, Bettina, deteriorated. There were arguments, periods of estrangement, attempts at reconciliation that never quite took. And underlying all of it was an unspoken reality. Casey was not living up to the standard. She was not protecting the family name. She was becoming a problem. In 2009, Bettina made a decision. She disinherited Casey, along with 2 of her other children, Jaime and Daisy. The official reasons were never fully disclosed, but those close to the family suggested that Bettina felt these 3 had not honored the family or maintained the values she expected. In other words, they had failed a test they may not have even known they were taking. Casey's response was public and painful. She spoke to the media about feeling abandoned, about the cruelty of being cast aside by the one person who was supposed to love her unconditionally. She didn't just lose an inheritance, she lost proof that she mattered. And for someone already struggling with addiction, mental health issues, and a sense of not belonging, that loss was devastating. Less than a year later, Casey Johnson was found dead in her Los Angeles home. She was 30 years old. The official cause was complications related to diabetes, but those who knew her understood that the real cause was more complicated. It was loneliness. It was rejection. It was the weight of growing up in a family where love had conditions, and she had failed to meet them. Her death sent shock waves through the tabloid world, but within her own family, the response was muted. There were private memorials, carefully worded statements, but no public reckoning with what had happened. No acknowledgement that perhaps the decision to disinherit a struggling daughter had played a role in her downfall. But Tina Johnson would live another 7 years, and when she died, her will stood as written. Casey, even in death, received nothing. The message was clear. Forgiveness had limits, and so did a mother's love. This is the reality of inheritance in the world of the ultra-wealthy. It's not just about dividing assets, it's about power. It's about judgment. It's about a final accounting of who lived up to expectations and who didn't. And for those who fall short, the consequences can be more than financial. They can be fatal. Casey Johnson's story is tragic, but it's not unique. Across the landscape of American wealth, similar patterns emerge. Heirs cut off, fortunes weaponized, families destroyed not by the lack of money, but by its abundance. And when you start looking closely, you begin to see that these aren't isolated incidents. They're symptoms of a deeper problem, one that raises uncomfortable questions about what enormous wealth does to the people who possess it. Consider the Getty family, one of the richest dynasties in American history, built on oil, art, and ruthless business acumen. J. Paul Getty, the patriarch, was once the richest man in the world. He was also, by most accounts, one of the cruelest fathers imaginable. He believed wealth made people weak, so he withheld affection, withheld approval, and in some cases, withheld money, even when his own family was in danger. The most famous example happened in 1973. J. Paul Getty's 16-year-old grandson, John Paul Getty III, was kidnapped in Rome. The ransom demand was $17 million. The family had the money. J. Paul Getty refused to pay. He believed it would set a precedent, that other family members would be targeted. So he let his grandson remain captive for 5 months. During that time, the kidnappers cut off the boy's ear and mailed it to a newspaper. Only then did J. Paul Getty agree to pay, and even then, he paid only the maximum amount that was tax deductible, approximately $2.2 million. The rest he loaned to his son, the boy's father, at 4% interest. Think about that for a moment. A grandfather so committed to his principles or so detached from human emotion that he negotiated the price of his own grandson's life and charged interest on the remainder. This wasn't poverty forcing impossible decisions. This was wealth so vast, it had disconnected him from basic empathy. John Paul Getty III survived, but he never fully recovered. He struggled with addiction for years and eventually suffered a stroke that left him paralyzed and nearly blind. He lived the final decades of his life in that condition, a broken man from a broken family. And when J. Paul Getty died in 1976, his will reflected the same coldness he had shown in life. The bulk of his fortune went to the Getty Museum. His surviving family members received relatively modest sums, at least by billionaire standards. Some received nothing at all. But the Getty family's inheritance battles didn't end there. They continued for generations. Gordon Getty, one of J. Paul's sons, inherited control of the family trust. He fathered children outside his marriage, creating complex legal disputes over who was entitled to the family fortune. There were lawsuits, accusations, and bitter divisions that played out in public. The family that once symbolized American success became a symbol of dysfunction. Or consider the Murdoch family. Rupert Murdoch, the media titan, built one of the most powerful communications empires in the world. Fox News, the Wall Street Journal, HarperCollins, film studios, newspapers across multiple continents. A portfolio worth billions and influence that shaped politics in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. For decades, the question wasn't just who would inherit his wealth, but who would inherit his power. Murdoch has 6 children from 3 marriages. For years, it was assumed that his empire would be divided among 4 of them: Lachlan, James, Elizabeth, and Prudence. They were groomed for leadership. They sat on boards. They were given positions of authority. But as Murdoch aged, the dynamic shifted. Lachlan, the eldest son, emerged as the favorite. James, once seen as a potential successor, clashed with his father over editorial direction and eventually stepped away. The daughters were sidelined. Then came the divorce. In 2022, Rupert Murdoch divorced Jerry Hall, his 4th wife, after just 6 years of marriage. The settlement was reportedly in the hundreds of millions. But more importantly, the divorce triggered renewed discussions about succession. Who would control the family trust after Murdoch's death? Would it be divided equally? Would Lachlan consolidate power? Would the other children challenge the arrangement? In 2023, reports surfaced that Murdoch was attempting to change the terms of the family trust to give Lachlan sole control, effectively disinheriting the other siblings from decision-making power, though not necessarily from financial benefit. The plan, according to sources, was to ensure that the empire's conservative editorial direction would continue. The other children, particularly James, opposed this. What followed was a legal battle conducted mostly behind closed doors, with billions of dollars and the future of global media at stake. This is what inheritance looks like at the highest levels. It's not just about money. It's about control over institutions, over narratives, over the direction of industries, and the people caught in the middle, even if they're billionaires themselves, can still feel powerless, still feel betrayed, still feel like they were never quite good enough in the eyes of the person who mattered most. Or take the story of Sumner Redstone. He built Viacom and CBS into media giants. He was worth nearly $5 billion when he died in 2020. But the final years of his life were consumed by a bitter public battle over his mental capacity, his fortune, and who would control his empire. His daughter, Sherry Redstone, fought against former romantic partners, business associates, and even other family members for control. There were lawsuits, accusations of manipulation, claims that Sumner was being exploited. The battles were so intense that at one point, Sumner's former companions were escorted out of his home by security. When he finally died at the age of 97, his will left the bulk of his fortune to Sherry, the daughter who had fought the hardest, who had stayed the closest, and who had outlasted everyone else. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The family was fractured, relationships were destroyed, and the public had witnessed a spectacle that stripped away any illusion of dignity. These stories share a common thread. Inheritance in the world of extreme wealth becomes a battleground. It's where love is measured, where worth is determined, where decades of resentment, favoritism, and dysfunction come to a head. And the outcomes are rarely fair. They're rarely kind. They're often devastating. But here's the question that emerges from all of this. Why? Why do families with every possible advantage, every resource, every opportunity to do things differently, why do they so often fail? Why does the presence of so much wealth seem to guarantee so much pain? The answer is more complex than greed. It's more human than that. And it's what we'll explore next. The psychology of extreme wealth is not well understood by most people because most people will never experience it. But researchers who study the ultra-wealthy have identified patterns that help explain why so many of these families collapse under the weight of their own fortunes. And the explanations are not what you might expect. First, there's what psychologists call affluenza, though the term has been misused in popular culture. The clinical reality is more nuanced. When children grow up with unlimited resources, they often struggle to develop a sense of purpose or achievement. Everything is given. Nothing is earned. And while that might sound enviable, it creates a profound psychological void. Humans need to feel competent. We need to overcome challenges. We need to believe that our actions have consequences and that our efforts matter. When wealth removes all obstacles, it also removes the opportunity to build self-worth. This is why so many heirs struggle with addiction, depression, and aimlessness. It's not that they're weak. It's that they've been placed in an environment that makes it nearly impossible to feel truly accomplished. No matter what they achieve, there's always the question, would I have succeeded without the family name, without the family money? And often, the answer is no. That's a difficult reality to live with. Second, there's the issue of control. People who build enormous fortunes are, almost by definition, control-oriented. They're disciplined. They're strategic. They're willing to make hard decisions. These are the traits that allow someone to turn a business into an empire. But these same traits often make them terrible parents, because control that works in a boardroom doesn't work in a family. Children are not employees. They cannot be managed into compliance. And when parents try, the result is rebellion, resentment, or in some cases, complete emotional shutdown. Paul Getty controlled his family the way he controlled his business, with spreadsheets and calculations and ruthless efficiency. He saw his grandson's kidnapping as a negotiation problem, not a human crisis. That's not because he was a monster. It's because his entire worldview was shaped by decades of operating in environments where everything could be quantified, optimized, and solved through strategic thinking. Empathy was a liability in that world, and by the time he needed it, he'd lost the capacity for it. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there's the issue of legacy. For people at the top of the wealth pyramid, legacy isn't just about being remembered. It's about ensuring that everything they built continues, that their vision endures, that the empire doesn't crumble the moment they're gone. This is why so many patriarchs and matriarchs become obsessed with control even beyond the grave. They use trusts, stipulations, and conditions to try to force their children and grandchildren to behave in certain ways, to preserve the business, to protect the brand, to uphold the family name. But here's the problem. You cannot control people from beyond the grave. You can control money. You can control assets. But you cannot control love. You cannot control loyalty. And when you try, you create exactly the kind of resentment and dysfunction that destroys the legacy you were trying to protect. Consider the Mars family, one of the richest and most secretive families in the world. Mars, Inc. The company behind M&M's, Snickers, and dozens of other global brands is worth over $100 billion. The family has managed to avoid the public scandals that plagued the Gettys and the Johnsons, largely because they operate with extreme privacy and discipline. But even they have faced internal tensions. Forrest Mars Sr., who built the modern Mars empire, was notorious for his demanding nature. He expected perfection from his children. He insisted they work in the business and prove themselves at every level. He used the threat of disinheritance as a tool to maintain control. And while his children did eventually take over the company and run it successfully, the emotional cost was significant. Family members have described a culture of fear where love was conditional on performance and approval had to be earned every single day. This is a common dynamic in dynastic families. The founder sacrifices everything to build the business. They miss birthdays, anniversaries, milestones. They prioritize work over relationships because they believe they're building something that will take care of the family forever. But what they're actually doing is creating a transactional relationship with their own children, one where affection is tied to usefulness, where inheritance becomes the only proof of love. And when that inheritance is withheld or divided unequally or made conditional on behavior, it sends a devastating message. It says, you were never enough. You were never truly loved for who you are. You were only valued for what you could contribute. This is what happened to Casey Johnson. This is what happened to the disinherited Getty heirs. This is what's happening right now in the Murdoch family, where siblings are fighting not just for money, but for validation, for proof that they mattered to their father, that all those years of trying to please him, of molding themselves to fit his vision, that it meant something. Now, it's important to acknowledge that not all wealthy families follow this pattern. There are families who manage wealth responsibly, who raise grounded children, who use their resources to create opportunity rather than dependency. The Rockefeller family, for instance, has largely avoided the public dysfunction of other dynasties. They've done this through a combination of strict financial education, expectations that family members pursue meaningful work outside the family business, and a culture that emphasizes responsibility over entitlement. But these families are the exception, not the rule. And even they will tell you it requires constant, deliberate effort. It requires treating wealth as a responsibility, not a reward. It requires being willing to say no to your children, to let them struggle, to let them fail, and most importantly, it requires separating financial inheritance from emotional validation, because that's the core issue. When parents use money as a substitute for love or as a weapon to control behavior, they create a dynamic where inheritance becomes the ultimate judgment. And children, no matter how old they are, will internalize that judgment. They will believe that their worth is measured in dollars, that their value is determined by what they receive in the will, and when they're cut out or given less than their siblings or forced to meet conditions that feel arbitrary or cruel, It doesn't just hurt financially, it destroys them emotionally. It confirms their worst fear, that they were never truly loved, that they were always just assets to be managed or liabilities to be discarded. This is why inheritance battles in wealthy families are so vicious. It's not really about the money. It's about a lifetime of unresolved pain, resentment, and longing finally coming to the surface. It's adult children fighting for something they should have been given freely, proof that they mattered. And the tragedy is that no amount of money can provide that proof, because the one person whose opinion mattered, the one person who could have said, "I love you unconditionally, regardless of your choices or your failures," is gone. And what they left behind isn't love. It's a legal document, a final accounting, a scorecard that ranks children against each other and declares winners and losers. That's the deeper explanation. That's why families with everything still end up with nothing that truly matters. There's one inheritance story that stands above all others in its sheer audacity, its complexity, and its ability to expose every single dysfunction we've discussed. It involves one of the largest fortunes in American history, a will that shocked the world, and a legal battle that would redefine what family means in the eyes of the law. This is the story of Huguette Clark and her $900 million estate. Huguette Clark died in 2011 at the age of 104. She was the daughter of William Andrews Clark, a copper magnate and one of the original robber barons who built their fortunes in the late 19th century. When William Clark died in 1925, he left behind an estate worth roughly $300 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's approximately $5 billion in today's money. Huguette inherited a significant portion of that wealth, and over her lifetime, she managed it carefully, living off the income from investments in real estate, art, and securities. But here's what made Huguette's story extraordinary. For the last 20 years of her life, she lived in a hospital room. Not because she was ill. She had her own apartment on Fifth Avenue, one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in Manhattan. She had estates in Connecticut and California. But she preferred the hospital. She felt safe there. She had her own private room, paid for out of pocket at a rate of hundreds of thousands of dollars per year, and she rarely left. She had no children, no close family. Her only living relatives were distant cousins, descendants of her father's first marriage, people she had never met and who had never been part of her life. For decades, Huguette lived in almost complete isolation, her only regular contact with the outside world coming through her nurse, her lawyer, and her accountant. When she died, she left behind 2 wills. The first will, signed in 2005, divided her fortune among 20 or so distant relatives. It was straightforward, standard, the kind of will you'd expect from someone with no close family. But 6 weeks later, she signed a second will. This one disinherited every single relative. Instead, it left the bulk of her estate to her nurse, her lawyer, her accountant, her goddaughter, and various employees and caregivers. It also set aside $60 million to convert her California estate into a museum dedicated to her art collection. The relatives who stood to inherit millions under the first will and nothing under the second immediately challenged it. They argued that Huguette had been unduly influenced, that her lawyer and accountant had manipulated her in her final years, that she lacked the mental capacity to make such drastic changes. The case went to court, and what emerged during the trial was one of the most bizarre and tragic portraits of wealth and isolation ever documented. Huguette's medical record showed she was physically frail but mentally sharp. She played the violin. She corresponded with friends. She made her own financial decisions, often calling her broker directly to make trades. But she was also deeply eccentric. She had a collection of antique dolls worth millions. She purchased properties and never visited them. She spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on gifts for people she barely knew while living in a single hospital room. Her lawyer and accountant had billed her estate millions of dollars over the years. Her nurse had received gifts totaling more than $30 million, including cash, real estate, and a Stradivarius violin. The prosecution argued this was exploitation, that these people had taken advantage of a lonely, vulnerable woman. The defense argued that Huguette knew exactly what she was doing, that she had no relationship with her distant relatives and preferred to leave her fortune to people who had actually been part of her life. The trial revealed something profound about the nature of family in the context of extreme wealth. Huguette's relatives argued they deserved the inheritance because of blood, because they were family, even if they'd never met her. Even if they'd never sent a letter, made a phone call, or showed any interest in her well-being while she was alive, to them, family was a legal category, a biological fact that entitled them to a share of the fortune. But Huguette saw it differently. To her, family was the people who showed up, the nurse who cared for her every day, the goddaughter who visited, the employees who treated her with kindness. Blood meant nothing without relationship, and relationship, in her isolated world, had been reduced to transactional interactions with the few people who entered her orbit. In 2013, the case was settled. The relatives received $34 million. The rest of the estate was distributed according to a modified version of the second will, with the nurse receiving significantly less than originally designated, and several of the more questionable bequests being reduced. The settlement satisfied no one. The relatives felt cheated, the beneficiaries felt vindicated, but diminished, and the public was left with an unsettling question. What does family mean when the only thing connecting you is a name and a fortune? This case represents a turning point in how we think about inheritance. For most of history, the assumption was clear. Wealth stayed in the family. Blood relatives had a moral and legal claim to a share of the estate. But as families became more fragmented, as people lived longer and more isolated lives, and as the definition of family itself became more fluid, that assumption started to break down. Huguette's story exposes the emptiness at the heart of inheritance law. It treats family as a fixed category, but family is not fixed. It's dynamic. It's built on relationships, on care, on presence, and when those things are absent, what's left? Just a legal fiction. Just a list of names on a family tree who happen to share DNA, but nothing else. This is the reality for many of the ultra-wealthy. They reach the end of their lives surrounded not by loved ones, but by lawyers, accountants, and nurses. The people who inherit their fortunes are often strangers, or worse, they're relatives who spent years waiting for someone to die so they could claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. And this is where the turning point occurs. Because once you see inheritance through this lens, once you understand that it's often less about family and more about legal entitlement, you start to see these battles differently. They're not just about greed or dysfunction. They're about the fundamental failure of wealth to create connection. The way enormous fortunes, instead of bringing families together, push them apart. The way money becomes a substitute for love, and when that substitution is revealed for what it is, when the person dies and all that's left is the money, the emptiness becomes unbearable. Huguette Clark spent the last 20 years of her life in a hospital room, surrounded by her dolls and her nurses, estranged from everyone who might have loved her for who she was, rather than what she had. And when she died, the people who fought over her fortune were fighting over the wealth, yes, but also over the question of whether they had any claim to her at all, whether they mattered, whether, in the absence of relationship, blood alone was enough. The court said it wasn't. Blood wasn't enough. And that decision, more than any dollar amount, revealed the truth about inheritance in the modern age. It's not a birthright. It's not guaranteed. It's a choice. And when that choice is made by someone who felt abandoned, isolated, or unloved by their own family, the results can be devastating for everyone involved. This is the key turning point, the moment when we stop seeing these stories as isolated scandals and start seeing them as symptoms of a deeper crisis, a crisis about what it means to be family, about what wealth can and cannot do, and about the price we pay when we confuse the two.